Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this presentation, Beyond Buzzwords, using the science of reading for impact. We've got so many educators joining us today and sharing with our colleagues that we're actually hitting capacity for this event platform. If you encounter any glitches here, please follow the link in the Q&A to view on YouTube. And remember, all registrants will receive an email on Friday with links to all the session recordings, so you won't miss anything. For closed captioning, please look in the Q&A box below for the link. The link will open in a separate window on your computer. There are multiple languages available to choose from. All of the sessions today will be recorded and will be available for replay right here as soon as the session ends. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the presentation, and if time permits at the end of the session, we'll answer some live. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carolyn Strom. Dr. Carolyn Strom is a clinical assistant professor of early childhood literacy at NYU Steinhardt. As a former classroom teacher, she is passionate about bridging the divide between neuroscientific research and instructional practices in early reading development. Currently, she is leading an initiative with early childhood teachers and parents called Cortex in the Classroom, which centers on the practical application of reading science. Dr. Strom has studied the course of children's reading and spelling development for the past 2 decades and published her work in The Reading Teacher, the Reading League Journal, and the Handbook of Learning Disabilities. She maintains an active clinical practice where she works with families who have children with dyslexia and related reading difficulties. Now, without further ado, here's Dr. Carolyn Strom.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here and to I was looking at the chat to see that so many people are coming from all over and that you've taken the time to be here. So thank you so much. I've entitled this talk Beyond Buzzwords, Using the Science of Reading for Classroom Impact, because I think we're at a really exciting moment in the science of reading. And I want to talk about how we can go beyond buzzwords and make real change. So this is a quick overview of our time together, and I'm hoping to have time at the end for Q&A. It always feels a little weird to give a presentation without seeing all of you. So I'd love to hear your questions and get to know you guys as an audience. So let's just start with the big picture. What is the problem, right? And we know, I'm sure if you're here and if you're in education, you know that the majority of our kids are not reading proficiently in 4th grade. Which is a big problem. The other problem is that we know that there's a lot of scientific research on how to address this problem. There have been decades of research on how children learn to read. But I think what we've realized over the last 20 or so years is that research doesn't change practice by itself. Right? We can't just give teachers research and magically change practice. That's not how it works. And I'm particularly passionate about this chasm between research and practice because I started off as a classroom teacher. So a little over 20 years ago, I started as a 1st grade teacher in Compton, California, and taught for 8 years out there and really fell in love with that moment that kids have when they turn squiggles and letters and dots into sounds and speech. Anyone who's taught children to read, as I'm sure many of you have, know how amazing it feels to be a part of that journey with a child. So I became really curious about both the visible behaviors going on with kids, but also about the invisible processes going on in their brains, which led me to study the science of reading development. And now at NYU, I work with educators and also partner with schools and families. And the core of my work in classrooms and with educators and with families is really how can we take the science of reading, specifically the neuroscience, everything that happens in the cortex, and connect it to the classroom. So today I'm just going to share some images and frameworks from my work with cortex in the classroom. So I find that whenever we begin to talk about beginning readers, it helps to center ourselves in the mind of a beginning reader. So I want you to try to read this as best as you can. Notice what's happening in your mind. How are you compensating? Can anyone guess in the chat what text this is from? Probably the majority of you have read this text before. Are there any guesses? Okay, it's from, I'll give you a picture. So maybe now there could be some guesses in the chat. Good night, moon. Yes, yes. Valerie says she's looking for patterns, right? That's what you're going to do if you don't know the code, right? So my point with putting up the picture here is to show us that even with the picture, we're not going to figure this out. The only way that we would figure something like this out is we have to know the code. Maybe some of the symbols look familiar to you because it's from the International Phonetic Alphabet. So some of the symbols with English overlap. But I think this just reminds us what a beginning reader feels and thinks. So here's the translation into English on the right. And you can see when you look at these words, you've automatized this process. And so it's a very different experience than if you're looking at it in the code on the left. And I don't mean this to say, right, that reading is a visual exercise. We know that in order to read, right, we need to map these visual symbols that we're seeing to sounds. And that's a phonological process and an internal process, not just a visual process. So here I showed what a typical mapping of moon would look like, right? You're mapping the the ooh, and the n to sounds. So now that we're centered in the mind of a beginning reader, realizing how difficult it looks when we don't know a code and what we have to do, let's go a little bit deeper into how we build this reading brain. So we're going to start with a view of the brain from the underside. So if we can imagine we're lying on our backs and we're looking up at the brain, and this is on the left side. And when we're born, right, children come with a brain with regions solely dedicated to recognizing faces and objects, right? They can see a face, recognize it's a face, store it. They can see an object, recognize it's an object, store it. But they don't come with an area of their visual cortex devoted to words. Simply don't have that, right? Over time, we have to build an area, and now we can see it in scans, that we actually build an area of our brain that responds to written words. The scientists call it the visual word form area or the letterbox. But the important thing to know is we are not born with it. We have to build it. So what that looks like, oops, I don't know what that clicked on. Sorry about that. What that looks like in a scan is up here, right? So green represents words. In 9-year-old strong readers, we see a green area light up, which means that they have this letterbox. They have this area that now is tuned to written words. But if we look at 9-year-old dyslexics, they don't have that activation. They have the activation for objects and faces, but not for the letterbox. And this work, and I don't know why that's happening, this work comes from Dahan 2013, and actually the link was going to his article, which I would encourage you to check out from Cerebrum. But what he really has found, and he's coined this term, the letterbox, to point out that readers, when you can read, you have this area that we see. And when you can't read, you don't have this area tuned to written words. For the rest of the slides that I'm going to show about the brain, we won't be looking at the underside like this. We'll be looking at the left side. So just the left hemisphere, because that's where a lot of most of the activity for reading is taking place. So again, just where we're going is how do we build this circuit and what does it mean to recognize a word and to develop this area of our brain responsible for recognizing words? Well, first we have to think about what is a word. So words have 3 kinds of representations. If you think about a word, think about any word. The word bat, for example, what comes to your mind? It has 3 representations in a skilled reader, right? We have the written form or the orthographic form, and that just means what it looks like in print as this letter string or visual symbols. We also have the phonological form or the speech form, the way it sounds, bat, which can be segmented into 3 sounds, bat. But that's not complete, right? That's not a word in and of itself. It's a word when we link it to the semantic representation. So a word also has a semantic form or a meaning form, bat, which of course is going to change depending on context, right? So this very same orthographic form and phonological form can actually mean 2 different things depending on context. So these representations need to be fused into one neural representation in our minds. So one way to think about this is how this is happening in the brain. So if we think about where these representations are stored in the brain, this is a helpful map, I think, to do that. So this brain is not to scale. It's a cartoon brain that I use with educators and families to explain what's happening in the reading brain. So we know, right, that the orthographic form corresponds to vision, the phonological form corresponds to speech, and the semantic to meaning, right? Now, the blue and the yellow are spoken language areas, right? That's our conception of BAT comes from these spoken language areas. And our spoken language areas, we're wired for that. We're wired for spoken language, so they're connected. But we're not connected to the orthographic form. We actually need to create a circuit called the phonological root that we'll talk about in our event today. And then eventually we create the lexical root, which is when words are retrieved faster and stored in memory. The way that a word is processed looks something like this inside the brain. This is also from DeHaan's work. And he here shows how a word enters our visual cortex in the back and then moves all the way forward to spoken language areas, right? And the thing to recognize with this image here is that this is happening in a fraction of a second, right? We are not aware of how our brains are processing words. We've created this circuit a long time ago and it runs automatically. But I want us to, as we sort of continue to talk about building the reading brain, keep this as like the end in mind, right? We don't come with these reading circuits. This is the brain of a skilled reader that's building the phonological root on top of spoken language and then building a faster root. So when we think about building the reading brain, we're really talking about building these different pathways. And what I found in working with educators and families in the community is that using game graphics or the metaphor of building neighborhoods in our brain really helps. So then we don't get sort of mired in some of the technical jargon, right? We want to understand what's going on in the brain conceptually and then concretely into the classroom. So we use these game graphics to represent neighborhoods. So you'll see where the speech form lives in the phonological area, we have Sound City. And these buildings represent capacities in Sound City. So all of our phonological awareness capacities, we're developing those in Sound City. In the semantic area of our brain, we have mountains of meaning, right? For every word we learn, like that, we create a little mountain of meaning. Now, we don't literally create mountains of meaning, right? But this is the metaphor that I've used. And I've actually found that a lot of kids really respond to it and enjoy sort of thinking about their brain as having these little neighborhoods that are communicating. So with spoken language, we're wired for it. So these neighborhoods are tightly linked, right? And of course, we need to build them. But Sound City and hearing sounds and producing sounds and making meaning and understanding are linked. That's spoken language. All the way over here, we have vision villages, right? And we have areas of our brain responsible for recognizing objects and areas responsible for recognizing faces. But again, we don't have any area of our brain that's organized just to respond to the written word, right? There's no little village for it in the way that there's a village for objects or faces. No connection, right? And it's important to remember here again, that we're wired for spoken language, right? We've been speaking for tens of thousands of years, and we've only been reading for about 5,000 years. So think about that. These areas of the brain, the yellow and blue, this green pathway, we've been using that for so long as humans. We've only been trying to make these connections to vision villages for a relatively short period of time. So when a beginning reader sees this, the word to us, which we recognize instantly as bat, they're just seeing lines, right? Lines and curves. It looks like Greek to them. They don't know what to do with it. It has no spot in vision villages. It's up to us to help them build this, and that's what the rest of this talk will be about. But I want to point your attention to this tower that we've put in this model on the left, which represents the executive functioning tower. So if you think about any neighborhood, right, there's some sort of something that controls things. There's a switchboard for the electricity or the water, right? So we have the executive function tower, which controls everything, right? And so we have to remember that when any learning is happening, right, your executive functions really have an impact on all of it. And so the way that we explain this to kids and educators and families is that this executive function really, really governs the building process of this city, this civilization that we're building, which is reading. So we need to begin to connect these areas. And this is where the work is with building the reading brain. So we know that we have sound city and mountains of meaning that together form spoken language, right? But we need to connect to vision villages. The very first thing we need to do is to develop phonological representations of spoken words as sequences of sounds, which we're not wired to do because we don't focus on sounds when speaking, right? We focus on meaning. But in order to read, we need to become aware of the fact that words can be broken into sounds. And where does that happen? That happens in sound city, right? So these earliest years of reading, the building sound city is such an important aspect of the process. The other thing we need to do, in addition to hearing words and segmenting them into speech sounds, is we have to retrain these neurons that are usually used to recognize objects and faces to identify specific letters, right? We do not have an area of our brain for letters. We have to develop it. And letters and words are not objects, so we can't process them the same way that we process objects. So what that looks like in the brain is these neurons have to become tuned to different letter features, right? The neuron says, oh, there's a little line. That could be a B, could be a D, could be an O. But what the brain is doing is getting tuned to these letter features. And we face a particular challenge as human beings with this. And the challenge is mirror invariance, right? So we talked about how the brain is wired to recognize objects. But the thing with objects is no matter which way you turn them, they retain their meaning, right? They retain their identity. So whether a chair is facing to the right, to the left, whether it's upside down on a desk facing right or upside down on a desk facing left, it's still a chair. A chair is still a chair is still a chair. But that's not the same with letters, right? If you flip a B around, it becomes a D. And if you flip it below, down to the bottom, it becomes a P or a Q. And that is a huge challenge, right? Doesn't mean kids are dyslexic when they're having this mirror invariance. It means they're having to overcome this aspect of their brain, this symmetry mechanic that we're all born with. So that's why we might see something like this. So this was something, this is a schedule that a 4-year-old wrote his remote learning at home, Lego, art, read, right? And we can see that he's still working on unlearning mirror invariance. And I found that families especially really appreciate understanding that actually when kids are doing this at a young age, they're exhibiting completely normal behavior. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're dyslexic if they're mirroring images, right? Mirroring letters, because what's happening is they're processing it as an object initially. And we know that objects don't change based on their positions, but letters do. So that's a huge insight that beginning readers or young readers need to have. So after we've it's sort of in parallel, we're working to recognize these letters, right? And undo mirror invariance and retrain these neurons. And we're making connections between these letters in Vision Village and the phonemes in Sound City, right? So these little eyes and ears that you see are the neurons. These are vision neurons. These are auditory neurons. We're responsible for processing speech. And each of these, right, has to connect to a phoneme. These neurons have to be communicating with each other in order to learn to read. And this, I found with educators, really helps see why it's so important for segmenting, right? If you can't segment a word into its individual sounds, then how are you going to map these letters which represent individual sounds, right? You have to segment. So Sound City and Vision Villages really work together, which this image is supposed to convey. And ultimately, right, we want to form these really strong mappings between individual letters and the representation of tiny sounds. And this is the beginning of what we call the phonological root. right? I tell the kids that there's no way you're going to be able to look at this word and go straight to mountains of meaning. No way, because these letters represent sounds in Sound City. You got to go through Sound City at the very beginning of the reading process. There is no other way. It's very empowering for young children to understand sort of what's going on in their brain. And again, nothing is to scale here. It's a conceptual model. So as we've built Sound City and blended these speech sounds into words, eventually, right, we can map it to a spoken word in our lexicon. So with that, for example, we've brought it together, b-at, and now you see that ear turns purple. The reason it turns purple is because it means that Vision Village is red, and Sound City blue have come together to make purple, right? Which is a mapping, a unit. So now we have this mapped unit that, and it's in a form, it's purple, it's combined, right? It's mapped, the visual and the phonemic part of the word, the letters and the phonemes, into this representation bat that we can find. So that was a quick overview of how we build the reading brain and some graphics that I've found useful with the phonological root. I'm going to transition now into what building the phonological root looks like in the classroom. So we've been covering sort of the cortex and how we work with educators and families to describe the cortex. But I want to move now into how to build this brain in the classroom. But I'm going to take a quick look at the chat to see if there's any outstanding questions. It's so hard to be presenting and then remember the chat, because I'd love to see what you guys are saying or how this is how you guys are processing. Great. Yes. Oh, Grace, I see you say tracing the letters help. We're going to get into writing. Thank you. Great. Okay. So hopefully now you have this mental model, right, of what's going, and you've probably had a mental model, but I'm hoping that I've added something to it, to your mental model of what's going on in the brain. What kind of structures are we building? What kind of pathways are we creating to build the brain, right? But we know that learning takes place in the brain, but it also takes place in the classroom, right? And I'm a firm believer we need a deep understanding of both, right? So we're going to talk about building that phonological root, those mappings in the classroom. So the sort of arrangement that we use with the brain civilization model and phonemic awareness looks like this. So we describe these 3 levels of sound units in our language, right? We have the syllable level, which is like a building in Sound City. We have the microsyllable level, which is the rhyme or the onset and rhyme pieces or the body and coda pieces, so part of a syllable. And then we have the phoneme level, right? So when we're talking about phonological awareness, we're talking always about these sort of levels of awareness of sounds, right? But that doesn't tell the whole story, right? Phonological awareness activities are not about just being aware of sounds. They're about manipulating them. Right? So there's a level of manipulation along the bottom, right? So we want to identify at all of these levels, blend and segment, as well as reverse, add, subtract, or substitute, which my undergrads have created as RAS. They've created a mnemonic for the final phase. So what this looks like at every phase, right, are certain kinds of games and engaging activities that play with sounds. So I'm going to share with you a game called Sound Spin, which works at the phoneme level and identifying words with common phonemes, right? And then we're going to talk about Turtle Talk and Motor Mouth, which are 2 other games that get at segmenting and blending. And then we're going to talk about Fiddle with the Middle and Sound Swap. And these deal with manipulating. Sound Swap deals with manipulating sounds at the microsyllable level, so it's only changing out the onset. And Fiddle with the Middle involves changing the middle sound at the phoneme level. So it deals with the phoneme up there. So just wanted to share with you this graphic that helps people map sort of the building block of sound, the segment of sound that we're working on, and then also the level of manipulation. And we know that these can be done in kind of drill-like exercises, but a lot of my work has been with young children, 3 and 4-year-olds. And so we work with a lot of games to get at phonemic awareness. So I'm going to share some of them with you. The first one, and I'll bring you back to the chart for a second. The first one is going to be fiddle with the middle. So fiddle with the middle is all about changing the medial sound, right? It's like very difficult for Sound City to do this, especially for a beginning reader. So these are your starter words. And what you're going to do right now is you're going to change all of these, the middle sound of all these words to ah. So mop with ah would become map. What about clip? What does clip become if you change the middle sound to ah? Clap. Sock becomes, how's the chat? People getting it? Yes. Sock becomes sack, and pen becomes pan. And I'm showing you versions. This can be played in person, or it can also obviously be played remotely. What we've found is that by using one medial sound at a time, when you're working with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, really helps to focus on changing one medial sound for all of the objects. So that's one example. Another example of building Sound City in the classroom are these 2 kinds of modes, turtle talk mode and motor mouth mode. And kids are pretty aware of modes, right? Minecraft has different modes. So we tell them, well, there's turtle talk mode and there's motor mouth mode. So turtle talk is when you segment into sounds. So van would become v, ah, right? Fan, f, ah, And whenever we do turtle talk, we always put 2 word or objects together that are minimal pairs. That's the speech pathology term for words that are different by one phoneme, right? So van and fan. And so we focus on where it's made in the mouth. Bag and bat. But for turtle talk, bag would be b, a, g, and bat would be b, a, t. So again, instead of calling it segmenting and blending for parents, for families and educators, we now say you want to turtle talk it or you want to motor mouth it. Segmenting and blending, right? So motor mouth mode is a little different. I say it slowly. I say it turtle talk and you say it fast. So you saw the first one. So this one, I would say b, a, k, and then you would say back. I would say p, a, n, and then you would say pan, and we would see if you're right. So for that one, I would say p, e, t. You would say pet, and we'd check through the picture. And, you know, kids get very excited when you say it in turtle talk and then they say it in motor mouth, and then the right picture comes up. So I know many of you are probably doing a lot of phonemic awareness, a lot of segmentation and blending. But we've found that calling it turtle talk and motor mouth really engages kids. You can call it whatever you want, but, you know, adding some fun and joy to it as we play with language has just been really rewarding. In the classes I've been working with. So another way to build Sound City, which is really building up the phonological area of our brain, right, to help make the phonological route to mountains of meaning, is a concept called phoneme substitution. So I'm sure you guys have seen phoneme substitution plenty of times. This game is called Sound Swap, and it's by Phonics Man. You can find him on YouTube. I don't know him personally, but I do use his birthday song, and it goes like this. What he does is he sings happy birthday to his own beat, and then he has kids change the initial sound. So if you change it to happy birthday becomes mappy mirthday.
Birthday, it's your birthday. Let's go.
Happy birthday, Moo Moo.
Sing it.
Happy birthday, Moo Moo.
Yep.
Sing the sound, now switch it up. Sing the sound, now switch it up. Birthday, it's your birthday.
Let's go. Birthday, it's your birthday. Say it, say it.
Birthday, it's your birthday.
Say it, say it. Birthday, it's your birthday. Say it, say it.
Birthday, it's your birthday.
Sing the sound, now switch it up, switch it up. Sing the sound, now switch it up, switch it up. Birthday, it's your birthday. Say it, say it.
Birthday, it's your birthday.
Let's go. Happy birthday, moo moo. Say it, say it.
Happy birthday, moo moo.
Switch. Happy birthday, Sue Sue. Say it, say it.
Happy birthday, Sue Sue.
Switch. Happy birthday, boo boo. Say it, say it.
Happy birthday, boo boo.
Switch, switch. Happy birthday.
So you guys get the idea. You can do it with any song or any rhyme. So if you did row, row, row your boat with the z phoneme, z, it would be zo, zo, zo your zoat, right? If you change it to po, po your pote. What I like to do with students as we're just getting into this kind of activity is sing the chorus of Frozen, right? Let it go, let it go. But change that initial phoneme. So if you change it to it would say met it mo, or duh would be dead it do, and it provokes laughs constantly, right? And I just want to say that really shows us that there is such a value in word and sound play for kids, right? Yes, it has a scientific term. Yes, it's called phonological awareness. But it can be really fun because changing sounds changes meaning. And really helps us build our reading brain, as we saw before. So the last two games or exercises I'm going to share with you to build Sound City deal with a spinning mechanism. So the first one is a sound spin, but you identify words with a common initial sound. So the focus phoneme here would be and I'm going to spin. And as I'm spinning, make some noise. Okay, so we landed on place. So we landed on place, and we have to think of a place that starts with Can you guys see my spinner? Did my spinner work? Okay, so hopefully you guys are seeing my spinner, but a place that starts with would be a place like Manhattan, right? Or Mozambique. For another sound spin, wait, actually, I just have a question. Were you guys able to see the spinner game? Okay. Okay, you can't see the actual spinner working. Got it. All right, so I won't be able to show you that, but I can tell you about it, that in each of these, as they are right here, you would be spinning. So for this one, right, let's start at the top. For this one, when you sound spin like this, there are categories. So the idea is our focus phoneme is or our focus phoneme is oi, or our focus phoneme is ow, right? And then you spin, and when you land on a certain object, right, you either think of an animal or a food or a name that starts with that focus phoneme of the day. You can also use a sound spin to decode. And when you land on a word, you decode it. And there's all kinds of fun noises for it. So we've been talking about sounds, but I want to remind us that as we're building Sound City and playing games and moving and manipulating sounds to help us build up Sound City, we also must pay attention to individual letters, right? It's not just about sounds, it's about the mapping of sounds to letters. So I want to just highlight one study that's a classic study in the field that I go over with my students. And what happened was there were two groups, and actually this is a study by McCandless and his colleagues, and I believe he's presenting in the afternoon, right after this. So two groups were taught 16 words in a novel script, and they were told, this is the word fog, much like a Chinese character. You just have to kind of look at the whole word. This is the word fog. The other group was taught the same alphabet, but they said that each of the shapes in these words corresponds with a letter. It's much like an alphabet, right? So they trained each group with 16 letters, 16 words, and you can think of this as a whole word condition or an individual letter condition. And what they found was when they had this group read new words they'd never seen before, this whole word attention group couldn't read any new words, 0. They couldn't apply any of their skills. And they actually activated the wrong side of their brain. They activated the right hemisphere. And we know that skilled reading activates the left hemisphere. In the other group that saw the new words, the letter attention group, they were able to read 79% of the new words, right? Just because they had paid attention to the letters. And what was shown in the brain scans was that they activated the left hemisphere, right? And so I emphasize this study because it really gives such clear proof, right, that emphasizing letters is really important in addition to building Sound City. And the bottom line here, right, is that we're not processing these words as objects, right, which is why we need to attend to each of the letters. So we should not be seeing something like this, right? And I know you all know that, but we still see exercises like this, which are not about the letters, right? This is about shapes, right? We should never see kids being encouraged to look at the shape of the letters because the shape does not correspond to the sound. And we know from all of the science that the key with reading is mapping these letters to sounds. So we also know, oh, sorry about that. Skip that for a second. We know that in order to map these sounds and letters, right, writing is such a key mechanism for that, right? So I'm going to show you an example that I'm sure you guys have witnessed before, but this is from a Head Start preschool where I've been doing some of this Cortex in the Classroom work, and we've been working with teachers and kids talking about building Sound City, building the phonological root, and how important it is to map letters and sounds. And writing, early writing, is such a natural way to make that mapping. So you're going to see him trying to write, I watched Power Rangers. And if you want to do a quick experiment, take out a pen and write, I watched Power Rangers. It'll probably take you 5 seconds. And I want you to watch what's going on with him, from everything from his graphomotor to his overall processing.
I watched Power Rangers. I watched Power I think I finished it, Sam.
So again, just like we looked at that passage at the beginning to remember what it's like to be a beginning reader, I like to show this to remind us what it's like to be a beginning writer, right? They have to make all those mappings and coordinate the graphomotor. And if they're lucky enough to be in school, they also have to, filter out some other noise and other language. And they have to remember what they're writing as they are going through this laborious process. But I've included some mini maps of the brain up here of how the brain develops over time. And again, we're just building this phonological root right now, the connection from Vision Villages through Sound City over to Meaning Mountains, and mapping through writing, early writing is just an excellent process.
Which one's
So some other research related to writing is around graphomotor gestures. So there's some recent research that has shown that handwriting practice, not tracing or typing, so actually thinking about how to make the movement, leads to cortical changes that make it easier to then identify letter shapes and correctly map them to sounds. So I know we've seen a lot of tracing over the years, but if you think about tracing is actually relatively passive, right? If kids are given a motor plan or a way of thinking about how to form the letter, that actually helps them make that mapping more so than tracing or typing. And so sometimes you might hear this called phonemic spelling, right? Which really is what we saw in the video, which is linking speech, vision, and motor skills. This is the kind of early writing we really want to see, right? I don't know if you can read this, but it says, I have an Elsa dress, right? And she has almost every single phoneme down in this sentence. And I've heard from preschool educators and kindergarten teachers a lot that like, oh, I wouldn't be able to put that up because our director wants all spelling to be perfect, right? And we can't put things that don't look perfect up on the bulletin board. And I would really encourage that mindset, maybe some of this research can shift that mindset, because this is perfect on the left for a 3 or 4-year-old. That really shows us that they're mapping sounds and symbols, right? We don't want to see a kid who's just copying what an adult has written, because while that might be empowering on some level, it's not unlocking the code for them. It's not helping them make those mappings. So just going to pause here for a moment, because we talked about what goes on in Sound City, what kind of connection we're making, and then we talked about some phonological awareness activities to really build Sound City, but also remembering not to forget about the letters. And even though this talk is really quick, and we just did this really quickly, this actually happens over many, many years, right? So this process starts in the earliest years and extends all the way through 2nd, 3rd grade, right? It's a really long process. So I just want to contextualize it, that over time, we develop a letterbox. We call it letterbox lookout, but which really is where the words are stored in memory, right? And they're mapped along the lexical route. And this is really when we're reading words from memory, we're reading on a faster route. The phonological awareness route the phonological route is still engaged, but we're reading on a faster route called the lexical route. And we build this. And this is what the brain civilization looks like when you've learned to read. You really have this network that's working automatically without conscious thought. And I ran out of time to get into how this maps to Erie's phases. But when I go through with kids and educators and families about how reading develops, and we emphasize that reading happens over a long period of time, we also ground that in the brain. So for those of you who are familiar with the phases of reading, the brain civilization models roughly correlate to the pre-alphabetic, partial alphabetic, full alphabetic, and consolidated, right? And this is just saying how we learn to make these mappings at every different phase. We go from making single letter mappings to 2-letter mappings to then mapping by syllable in the consolidated phase. So again, even though this was super short, I don't want anyone to be confused that reading happens overnight or in a year, right? It takes many, many years to get to mastery. And there's different skills that we focus on at every phase. So in closing, I really think that in order to go beyond buzzwords, I hope it's been clear that I think we need clear metaphors about what we're talking about when it comes to the brain, right? Rather than just terms, we need to really gain a deeper understanding through, I think, explanatory metaphors. And the other thing I wanted to just say is, this should, if we looked at it, you probably said unite. I think because you looked at the context when it really says untie. So it's a subliminal message here to remember that we always have to look at the details of words and not rely on the context. And I also just want to encourage everyone to stay connected. So my students have been using these images as posters. And so they're going to be available soon if you guys want them. My website information is there if you want to sign up for my newsletter. I'd love to hear from you. And I can take questions in the last minute.
Awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. I don't know if we have time for questions, but
Right.
one question that I did see throughout the chat is, when should we be concerned about reversals and just reversals in general? Was it?
Yeah. Yeah, there's no hard and fast cutoff for that. There's just a lot of research on how important it is to work on the motor plan early on, since that's what can undo it, right? But you don't want to see kids, usually when they finish the partial alphabetic phase and they enter the alphabetic phase, they should have undone their mirror invariants.
Awesome. Thank you. This was amazing. We're out of time for this session. We will have a quick 5-minute break. And then for our next block, you will have the choice of 2 sessions. And don't worry, they're recorded so you can watch the one you missed later. To go to the next session, go to the schedule button in the top left corner and drop down to the next session you wish to attend.
You know, and can I just say one thing, because I see people are asking about getting an online version of this. It will be available if you just shoot me an email or sign up for the newsletter. I see people asking for a link, and there's no link yet, but you'll be able to sign up on my website.
Okay,